I'm here with Ken Hanley to talk about the archaeological finds on the N22. Yeah. So, so Ken, it's just how did you find the kindergarten that there was something there? Let's say you were the field, you whatever. I'm just really curious. How did you decide to
Yeah,
dig there?
yeah. Like the discovery of that cremation is at the tail end of a very long process, a very structured process. My role in TI, I'm a project archaeologist, and my role is to oversee all the archaeological components of national road building projects in Cork, and Greenway projects and Lewis Cork project. So for the N22 bypass, the story of that project starts way back, probably in 2001, when there was a constraint study done. That's where they kind of take in a general study area. They kind of identify all the constraints
To the line of the road.
well,
Is
it's
it?
not in the line. It's just kind of a broad envelope that somewhere between here and there we want to put a
Ah,
road. So the first thing is you identify all the constraints. So these are all things you need to be aware of, so that when you are considering about routes and so on, you're aware of these constraints. And archaeology and cultural heritage is one of those constraints. There's others, engineering constraints and geological, ecological constraints and so on. So that's the next phase. Then is you move on to a route selection phase, and that's where within that envelope of ground you come up with various route options that you consider to be viable route options. And they sometimes you start off with a long list of route options, and they're whittled down to maybe 3 or 4 or 5, and then you do a proper route selection study, and that's where you look at the likely impacts of each of the routes, and you simply compare them. So one route might be very favourable economically, but not favourable environmentally, and so on. So
sure.
then you kind of put all that into a table, and you come up with a best fit a route that,
Mm.
on balance, comes out on top. You
Did
know,
you have to, in your, the archaeologists inputting into this process, have you come across many cases where the archaeology that you know to be there decides that the road has to shift a bit left or right? But in the N22, that wasn't the case,
Yeah,
was it,
no,
or was
no,
it?
it does influence decisions. Obviously, it's one of many factors that need to be taken
Ah,
on board, and like the process is transparent in that it all goes into a table. All the likely impacts. So one route might be favoured for a particular reason,
ah,
and less so for another. And taking all that into account, you come up with a preferred route. It's the one that has, I suppose, the least overall impact, or the one that's digestible by
sure.
most disciplines and so on, and that becomes the preferred route. And once you have that, then you go about the business of designing a road project along that route, and then you study the likely environmental impacts that route would have, and then in doing that, you're also looking at the impacts on cultural heritage, archaeology, architectural heritage, and general cultural heritage. And then you come up with mitigation commitments. So you're saying, okay, these are going to be the impacts. So this is what we're going to do to ameliorate those. So, one would be that you'd do more investigation to find is there any buried archaeology you're not aware of,
Mm,
or ones that you are aware of that you'd excavate those fully.
sure.
And so that then led us on to the program. Like the scheme itself was 20. Well, the route selection was looking at a bigger scheme, about twice the size, about 40 kilometres, going right into Ovens. But when it
Yes.
come to the EIS, they focused on the western portion of the scheme, about 22 kilometres. And so the EIS for that was done in 2009. So
Sure.
then it was approved by An Bord Pleanála. Obviously, you go to an oral hearing for the public. Everyone can have their say. Any feedback from that comes back in then, and they have a look at it, and then they present it to An Bord Pleanála, and An Bord Pleanála then decide whether to give planning or not.
Sure.
Sometimes they do give planning, sometimes they don't give planning, or they might give planning with conditions, extra
Yeah.
conditions and so on. So this scheme did get planning, and so then from our point of view, then we moved on to
So you have a defined
we
area
have a
now at that
defined area,
stage.
exactly.
Yeah,
We have a
yeah, yeah.
defined footprint of the route, so we have to now manage archaeological investigations on that route. So it's very
Sure.
structured. The first thing we try and do is do geophysical surveys. There's different techniques you can use, but they all are fairly non-invasive. So you cross the field with your apparatus, and it can pick up signals, magnetic signals from the ground.
Of
Um,
metal?
It can be, but let's say you have a kind of a natural subsoil, and that's got a certain magnetic signature to it. Say,
Okay.
but something dug into it, let's say a ringport ditch dug into it, and backfill it with something that has a slightly different magnetic property
Okay.
to the surrounding area.
So you're looking for patterns
Exactly,
of...
yeah. It's you normally get a grayscale pattern, and you can sometimes it jumps out, clear as day. Sometimes it's not so clear, and there's a degree of interpretation. So that was done for I think on 94 targeted locations in the scheme. I think it worked out about maybe 45 hectares of ground that were surveyed directly.
Wow.
So then we
So it was
followed.
so you had to target that section of ground.
Yes.
Yeah. So was that done on a basis of from the air of...
No, it's
all
on the ground.
on the ground.
Now there's different approaches. These days they can strap the equipment to the back of a kind of a cart, and they can even tow it by a quad bike. If the terrain is suitable, you have a kind of a low cut grass, broad field. That's ideal. Some cases you might just push the cart system. But if you go back far enough, most of it was done by hand. You'd carry the instruments yourself, and you'd set out a grid in the ground, and you'd trace up and down to a defined grid, and then plot those out. So all that does is it gives us geophysical anomalies, what we call them, just geophysical signatures from the ground.
Yes.
Some we can say, oh, clearly that's a site. Others are saying maybe it's archaeology, maybe it's just agriculture, maybe it's geology. We're not sure. But we kind of just identify all those locations, and then we commission what we call stage one. That's our testing phase, and we also do surveys at that. So the testing on the N22 Bypass, we tested roughly 85 kilometres of test trench, if you were to measure them linearly.
Sure.
And so that gave kind of roughly about a 12% coverage of the footprint of the scheme.
Wow.
So it gives you a good degree of confidence.
Sure.
And you're backed up then with your geophysics, where you have geophysics, so that you have a broader picture from the geophysics, and then you have test trenches running through.
Sure.
And normally the test trenches, you have typically a kind of a centerline trench with kind of offshoots going out maybe every 12.5 meters each side, and then you go up the other side and so on.
So it's really thorough. So
it's
once you select the area,
it's been as thorough as kind of reasonably practical. So
and in Kilnagarteen, just what did you find?
So that
alerted your curiosity.
Yeah. So the archaeologists, now these test trenches are put in by machine. They're machine dug, but they're all accompanied by an archaeologist. And so the archaeologist can see the machine cut through topsoil and then come down onto a natural subsoil. On occasions then where the archaeologist sees something that it considers to be of archaeological potential, they'd stop the machine, they'd investigate what it is and record it, photograph it, and maybe sample or something like that. In the case of Kilnagarteen, they spotted what looked like a dark pit in the ground, and so that was just marked as a feature of potential. Now we're obviously testing, so it's like looking through the keyhole. We can see so much in our test trench, but we don't know what the wider archaeology at that location. So
but it must be kind of exciting to be there with the digger. I'm familiar with dealing with a dig, and he's pulling along, scraping along, and all of a sudden you see something, you think, oh,
exactly, exactly. And the thing is, you never know what to expect. There's always surprises, and I think that's just the core. And the archaeologist still, enjoys that sense of discovery. So in that scenario, they found a pit. Now what we often do is in testing we might widen out the area just around where the test trench is. Not by much, just give a better feel. Is it high density, or is it just kind of one pit on its own? So that was done, and I think it suggests it wasn't high density. There was something there, and it could be other features. But so we just earmarked as a site now of potential. So the testing continues then, and they finished the whole scheme, and then once you've identified all the site's potential, then you come back to what we call stage two. It's pre-excavation services. So that's where they open up the area around the feature that you noticed.
Like take the topsoil away?
Topsoil off completely, So you might square out an area right around it. And then then it's a chance to clean back. So then we have a really good understanding what we're dealing with. If it's something very dense with archaeology, that's apparent. We can see that. Now they're not digging at that stage. They're just cleaning back and exposing. In the case of Kilnagarteen, I think they got one other pit or two other pits. One other pit, and that was it. So it was a low density site, but there seemed to be a flecks of burnt bone in one of them, so that kind of suggested possible cremation pit. So the next phase, so that was done for I think there was roughly 51 sites that were found after testing and geophysics to be of potential. So these are all opened up.
Sure.
And then we move on to what we call stage 2. Stage 1 also includes surveying. So we bring in. Sorry, I should have said from the outset that this work is done by commercial archaeological companies. The local authority would put out a tender for the works, and in the case of the N22, just for practical purposes, we divided into 3 contracts. Lot 1 was the western part, Lot 2 was the middle part, and Lot 3 was the eastern part.
This is for the archaeological work.
For the archaeological work,
Okay,
yeah. So just for management purposes. So one company called Rubicon Heritage Services, they were awarded Lot 1 and Lot 3, and then another company called TUS Ireland Limited were awarded Lot 2.
But you were over the whole, from the archaeological point of view? Did you head the whole?
Yeah, like my
area?
role, I said I work for Transport Infrastructure Ireland, so obviously they provide funding to Corcoran Council to do the work. So my role is an oversight role, and just ensure that the quality of what was being done. But the actual boots on the ground are by the archaeological companies, and they're archaeologists, and these are highly experienced. Like they move from project to project, and they build up a wealth of experience over time. So they're all highly specialised. So then you've opened up your site, and then you move on to stage 3, which is the actual excavation part.
Sure.
And that's where you send a team and you excavate whatever it is that's there. So in the case of Kilnagarteen, they found one pit with human cremated bones in it, and the other pit then didn't have any human bone in it, but it was nearby, and the radiocarbon dates we got from the 2 were similar, so the chance that they're both in use.
And were they both cremation?
No, just one. The other had no cremated bone in it. Now it's conceivable that there was cremated bone in the pit at a higher level that just got scoured in the kind of the topsoil zone through bioturbation and all that kind of stuff, but we just don't know. There's no evidence for it anyway, so it was just one cremation pit.
So I have this picture of the bones being enclosed in something, but
no, it's
that
a simple.
wasn't the case.
Like it does vary. You sometimes get cremations where the cremation is placed in an inverted pot. So the cremation is put into you cut a pit into the earth. You put your cremated bone remains, and you put a pot over them.
Yes.
And then you might cover with a lintel stone or something like that.
Yes.
Or you might wall it with stone for a kist burial. But often it's just a plain earth cut pit with no stone lining and no pottery, and that's what we had in Kilnagarteen.
Okay.
So that's how that site. So the same exercise then for other sites. Now because we're dealing with a road project, it's not like a research project where you decide where you want to dig, and you might have a particular research question in mind. We dig what we find. So that means that you can. Sites range typically from a single event, a single pit, to big complex enclosure or something like that. So you get the broad spectrum, and what I like about that is that it's more reflective of what's actually out there. If it's all research based only, you're going for the best sites. You're going for the hive status sites and so on. But it's just far more democratic in a sense, in that whatever's there is there, and you dig it. So it gives voice to everybody. It doesn't give voice just to the elite who have their big megalithic tombs. It could be your Joe Soap trying to survive with a family. They leave archaeological remains behind, and we're trying to study their life from this far removed.
But the fact of cremation, does that suggest that the remains of the princess, we call her, but it was special?
Well, if you get burials, let's say you take the burial we're talking now was Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age. But if you take the earlier period, the Neolithic period, and the practice of burying in megalithic tombs, it's without doubt that these were highly organised societies to be able to build these type structures, and clearly those buried in them were very significant people. By virtue of being, the top tier of their society, being prominent in some way in people's eyes or in their own eyes. They had their own means to make these tombs happen. Whereas in the Bronze Age, you get single burials like that, so it's more difficult to say the degree to which it's high status or not. Now we have relatively few burials in terms of what the population must have been,
Yes.
but all that probably means that there's just cremations, throughout the landscape that we're just not seeing. So it's hard to say this individual, was there an elevated status involved?
Sure.
There's no pottery, there's no funerary goods. Sometimes if you get that, that might suggest some
Yeah.
kind of degree of status, but we can't say. And I kind of like that. I like the thought that, that it's not high status. That it is somebody who breathed in the air, who drank the water,
Yeah.
and did their best to survive, and this was their resting place. And
So there was no DNA done. The DNA process of getting DNA done is quite...
for an individual like that, I mean, there's so little remains left.
Yeah.
It wouldn't form part of the project brief really now.
Sure.
What that might do if there was a broader population study, let's say by one of the educational institutions, that they may decide to decide which ones to do a broader research on.
That there was the possibility of it furthering our knowledge in a quite defined way.
Exactly, yeah. So there are ethics involved as well in terms of these are human remains after all.
Yes.
So there is a code of practice in terms of how they're dealt with. So decisions on that rest with the National Museum of Ireland, and they would, I imagine, take the view that it would want to be a well thought out, robust research program that's involved, and not just trying to find the hair color of an individual on your one site. It's not. It needs to be more significant than that. And
but it is a new area, which is yielding some amazing results.
It is like they allow us to see things that we can't see as archaeologists. Just like archaeology itself allows us to see things that others can. Like if you think there's kind of two types of archaeology. You have prehistoric archaeology, which prehistoric people were around maybe 8,600 years roughly. The historic period in Ireland is only about 1,600 years. So we've very little written history about the majority of our existence in this country. And so what's recorded by archaeology, it's not recorded by any other means. Archaeology is the only discipline that does that. That's the importance of it.
But DNA
absolutely adds a new frontier really on research. Now I'm aware of, I think it was 2016 or thereabouts, that there was I think an individual in the Neolithic period. That's when farming first came to Ireland. For years there was a debate about whether that was the knowledge of farming coming in or actual farmers coming in person, and that kind of waxed and waned in terms of people's thoughts on it. But that 2016 study of, I think it was an individual from a passage tomb in County Down, if I recall correctly, suggested that individual came from the Near East, so Iraq, Iran, that part of the world. So knowledge of farming moved through Europe, up into northern Europe and Western Europe, and it seems that it was the fact that the significance. Well, there's people, but the significance about it is that because there was somebody buried in a passage tomb, that means, according to our own theories, that's somebody that was at the height of Neolithic society.
Yes.
These were the passage tomb builders, so they were the elite. So that individual appeared to have come, or at least had ancestry from the Near East. So that suggests that there was a movement of people coming in, and that they brought knowledge of farming to the country. And so that's it's early days yet. I'm sure there's more studies ongoing.
And it can be dated more precisely as well. Not necessarily.
Yeah. Well, there's always, like with all scientific methods, there's always improvements, and equally with archaeology as well. There's always improvements in techniques and so on. And so dating has improved. A big novel approach in recent years is what they call Bayesian analysis. It's based on bringing knowledge to a formula. So if you're aware of, you get a series of dates, but you're aware that physically one feature cuts another feature that it's there for later, you might get a wide date range return from your radiocarbon date, but by applying Bayesian statistics, you can narrow that date range to maybe a generation or two.
Yes.
So that's improvements. And then just the science of dating is improving as well, all the time. So it's constantly evolving and constantly improving. So, but DNA definitely is a game changer in terms of it really will add a whole new layer of understanding.
Sure.
And equally, other scientific methods like isotope analysis. When we grow up and we consume, typically if we live in a locality, we consume what's there locally, and so there'll be difference in the isotopes of what we consume, food we consume, and so on, like carbon or lead or whatever substance be it drinking or eating, and by getting that signature of the isotope, types of isotope you have in the sample, you can look at the geology of an area and you might find that that signature doesn't match this locality, but it matches somewhere in southwest France, for example.
Okay.
So you can say that this individual grew up in southwest France and must have migrated here in adulthood.
Wow.
So that again adds a whole layer of understanding that, and you combine that with DNA, which is more about ancestry and so on, and physical appearance. I mean, it can tell you eye color, hair color, and the like. But it's really
mind boggles.
Yeah. So back to the jigsaw, there's a whole new cluster of pieces now brought to the table with these techniques.
Sure.
So it's an exciting time, but archaeology has a key role because archaeology is all about the primary data. Without the original excavation, we don't have the primary data, and all this follow-on analysis can't happen. So
I know.
But there's a perfect harmony between all the studies, and it's yielding great results.
I've seen photographs of the dig in Ballivorna, in near St. Gubrin as well. Professor Kelly and a big gang around, and the Fulach Fia, I suppose, is particularly interesting, and even the name. So just a little bit on.
Yeah, these O'Kelly. I think there's no excavation of a Fulach Fia in a country that doesn't mention O'Kelly. He excavated those sites in Ballyvorney, but more interestingly, he did some experimental work just to see there were accounts written in, say, the 1800s and so on about these being used as cooking sites. So he did an experiment to see, is that practical? Is that so? He wrapped some mutton in straw. He constructed a trough. He filled it with water. He set a fire. He heated the stones in the fire, submerged them in the trough. Sure enough, the trough boiled up in no time, and he submerged the straw covered meat, and I think within 30-40 minutes he had cooked meat, and so that was published as an experiment, and since then that's the prevailing theory of what these things were for, but the truth is we're not entirely sure what they were for, and the reality is probably that they were used for a multitude of things.
Yes.
I've no doubt cooking formed part of it, just by the simple fact if you're in one spot for long enough you need to eat anyway, but some of the theories on the cooking that was more communal, ceremonial, it was a kind of more feasting rather than just kind of eating, daily eating, exactly.
Yes.
So
and was he the first one that identified these? Had they been found previously and recognised?
They were recognised, but they weren't fully understood what they were, or not so much what they were, but how old they were. That sense of time wasn't known clear, and so some of the first, I think he was first to use scientific dating, radiocarbon dating, and that pushed it right back to the Bronze Age. So, So the prevailing theories are used for cooking, and like I said, the thinking was that the bigger the Falakfir or burnt mounds, what they're sometimes referred to, the bigger the example you had suggests that the more feasting was going on, so it must have been a bigger event, that kind of thing. And there's clear evidence that the burnt mound is formed by the clearing out of the stones. Once the hot stone goes into the water, often then they just fracture, they just shatter. And so the broken stone will be taken out and discarded, to the side. And over time, these mounds built up, and that's what you see in the ploughed fields as you drive by a black patch in the brown ploughed field. That's a clear sign of a burnt mound. So that theory prevailed, but there are other possibilities that they were used for cleansing or bathing. They could be used for dyeing cloths or preparing cloths and hides and so on. And they could be used for even brewing beer, and there are various theories on that. So the reality is that there's no one fixed proven theory,
Yes.
but all are viable to a degree. And so on the N22 bypass, we were very conscious of the fact that O'Kelly had done his experiments in the 1950s, right next, close by to the scheme. So we had discussions with the archaeological consultant involved, and we said that we need to try and push the boat out a bit in terms of the study. Can we add to O'Kelly's work from the 50s? And there have been a paper published by an archaeologist called Alan Hawkes a couple of years back that suggested that it might be possible that lipids, these are kind of fat proteins, that lipids might survive, soaked into the sandstone, the stone from the burnt mounds, and that it might be possible to analyse those. Now that technique had already been done for the likes of pottery, where the lipids would soak into, if you were cooking something in a pot, it would soak into the fabric of the pot, and that was proven successful. And they could tell that animal fats were in this pot once, and they could even tell if it was ruminants like cattle or sheep or non-ruminants like pig. So because of that paper suggesting it might be possible, for this project there was 22 samples sent off to Bristol University
From the N22
for
project?
the N22 project, and
Okay.
it was specifically to try and test O'Kelly's experimental theory on cooking. So the results came back. There was only one of the 22 samples had any kind of meaningful amount of lipid in it, and that indeed did suggest that there was fat protein of ruminants and non-ruminants from the sample. So we can say for that one site that clearly then and that was in Ballybran, I think, that they were processing or doing something that
Yes.
left behind lipids from animal fat. But for the other 21 samples, there was no meaningful lipids at
Yes.
all. So they were the results. The problem now is that what does those results mean? Is it that lipids just don't survive well in burnt mound conditions? And so what we're seeing is a lack of their survivability rather than they were never there in the first place.
Okay.
So it doesn't yet answer, we're not out of the tunnel yet.
No,
In terms
no,
of,
there's no out of that tunnel. Like
but,
there's no into.
But it's a very worthwhile exercise. It was the first time it was done at that scale, and it's already been published in Archaeology Ireland. So that at least that's a new insight.
I know.
And others might develop it further, but it does look like it does seem anyway that taking lipid samples and burnt mounds mightn't yield meaningful results. So in terms of where do you deploy your resources, it might mean that they're not ideal for it.
It kind of gives me a picture of how exciting archaeology could be if you're. It's just that idea of here's the result, come in for this. Oh, we've had this theory in our heads, and now we have this other piece that doesn't exactly fit what we had. And I'm just wondering if just to talk to you a little bit about what it was like for you, your interest in archaeology, that sense of adventure or treasure hunting, which everybody understands, treasure hunting.
Yes,
whoa, yeah. All the people that have the metal detectors, and children will gravitate towards getting a metal detector, So, did you spend the time wandering around with a metal detector as a youngster?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you're aware, like to use a metal detection device in Ireland, you do need a license. It's not that anyone kind of free range. But I do have a memory with an uncle who we did on the beach when I was a kid and being fascinated. But I think my interest in archaeology probably came from just a family trip where we just visited a stone circle, and I just remember being yay high and the stones themselves being huge, and just being amazed about how did they get them there and how did they stand them up, and just the time involved. My existence at that stage was only about 10 years, whatever the case may be, and thoughts of something having been there for millennia just blew my mind. So I assume that was how the seed that germinated, and then Julie then did archaeology in UCC, and I suppose I was lucky in terms of I came out in graduated in 1990, and then commercial archaeology was taking off in the country. It was just kind of the almost not quite, but almost the beginning of the Celtic Tiger and so on. So there was, and that led to one of the most intensive periods of excavation ever undertaken in the state.
Okay, so that was
So
that was a kind of a boom.
Yeah,
You came out in a boom ahead
exactly.
of the boom.
So then,
Okay.
like a lot of archaeologists, you got involved in the excavation circuit where you're moving from, it's very mobile career. You're moving from project to project, and that's you're young. You get to see the country. You meet some fantastic friends and so on. And then I took up a role with what was the National Roads Authority at the time. They're now operating as Transport Infrastructure Ireland. And so that was based in Cork, and so it's since then I've been involved in road projects in Cork and so on. So no, it's never every day's got something new, a new project, a new discovery, and a new chance to kind of engage with the public in terms of what we're doing and what we're finding and so on. So no, it's very rewarding, I have to say. Yeah.
And what, like, the information you find then feeds its way into academia as well. It's
absolutely,
once it's published, it feeds into
exactly,
a more general archaeological corpus of information.
Absolutely. Like the way archaeology is managed in terms of impact is that you either preserve it in situ, whereby you're able to avoid it, or if that's not possible, then you preserve by record, and that's where it's fully excavated. But the key thing is that the record of what you found then is preserved, and that's done by obviously securing the archive from the site, but also disseminating what you found. So letting people know, publishing the results, either in academic journals or in popular magazines or papers, or giving talks to interested groups or parties and so on, and like that. Now all the discoveries then obviously make their way into academia. They're taught in universities. There's research projects then that are always ongoing, and they always are keen to find new information, new discoveries, and bring them into the studies and so on. And there's no doubt about it that just the sheer volume of archaeology from road projects, and more recently then starting to see it from Greenway projects, and Lewis projects in Dublin is really changing a lot of the archaeology of the country, just by virtue of the sheer volume alone.
Of stuff.
It's very impressive thing.
Like the DNA side of it, I'm finding that to be utterly fascinating in terms of who's on this island and when did they arrive, and the different waves of people that you're confirming, like that early Bronze Age movement of people from the east here with such a defined effect. It changes how we see ourselves to some extent.
Absolutely. I mean, there is we do have our own kind of oral tradition of there being waves of people's coming in, and the DNA analysis, even though it's in its in its infancy really as a study in terms of ancient DNA analysis. But it is backing up some of that. Obviously the timelines are different, but it's giving real, what was a very kind of clouded picture. It's starting to see images of truth coming through in terms of what, but obviously the more and more that's sampled, the more refined all that will get. So I think we're in exciting times, and that will, I'd imagine, over the next couple of decades really bear fruit in terms of adding real nuance to our understanding, and I think it's a good thing, because it makes us realise that we have shared histories, and the more we realise that, I think the better for all. It's not it's not our culture and ours alone. We share it. We share with people. Some people have traditions of moving beyond. We've done it ourselves in terms of migration, moving to other countries, and the how significant that is to us, and they have that too. But moving here perhaps, so it's it is fascinating.
And is the DNA result showing from, say, southern Russia or southeast Russia?
Yeah,
or the Ukraine or some?
Yeah, I'm not a genetist. I'm just aware of there's an early study in about 2016 or thereabouts, and there was I think they took DNA from 3 early Bronze Age individuals, and the DNA results suggested that they would have come from the Pontic Steppes, which is kind of southern Siberia, Ukraine, Russia, kind of that kind of region.
Yeah.
So again, that's just based on those 3 individuals, and obviously the more that are studied, you'll get more nuance, because again, that could be just one strand of society. We don't know, but what's interesting is that the makeup of DNA that on balance most Irish have these days, that the kind of, I suppose, the signature of that DNA was kind of formed then in the Bronze Age, so that those Bronze Age people and us have very we don't have the same disruptive change in DNA since then.
Yes.
So we have and even archaeologically we're seeing that for the Iron Age, we kind of see ourselves as Celts typically and so on, but a lot of the Iron Age sites that we find, particularly, well, absolutely in Cork, but in particularly the Munster area, that you often find is that they're shown to be Iron Age sites purely because of the radiocarbon dating. We're not finding kind of typical Iron Age objects, Celtic objects, and by and large,
yes.
So it appears that the earliest part of the Iron Age, let's say, the chances are that there was just knowledge of ironworking and iron, iron artifacts being replicated here, and that's seen in the archaeological record where you get, Celtic style artifacts, but they're seen to be made here rather than brought in.
Yes.
But in terms of it being the Iron Age and people using iron on a daily basis, what's coming up strongly is that anytime we get our earliest evidence, certainly in Cork, of iron working, physical, slag and so on, sort of the process of iron smelting and smithing, that kind of kicks in around 300 BC and continues after. So that seems to be the time when it kind of becomes mainstream, where you get iron use kind of dotted around the county at that stage. So before that period, even though it's still the Iron Age from maybe around 800 or 700 BC, that early part, it seems to be more kind of contact with Celtic Europe and knowledge of ironing and maybe some use of iron, as opposed to widespread iron production.
Wow.
And that seems to come in later. And that 300 BC mark kind of coincides with the emergence of the Latin culture coming through Europe, Celtic culture. So that influence seems to have triggered a widespread use of iron around that period.
Yeah, it's very recent.
It's quite recent.
I didn't realise it was so recent.
That's in terms of iron, kind of common iron use. It seems to be from about 300 BC onwards. Certainly from the excavated sites that we're getting, that seems to be a trend. But I said the Iron Age proper starts around 800, 700 BC, that kind of time frame.
Yeah, and how going east then? Is it earlier as you go east outside of Ireland? The Iron Ages.
For most things, in terms of new innovations and technologies, it's the same trend. It tends to kind of come in, from Central Europe, East Europe, or whatever, further south, and make its way up. By and large, now, copper mining is interesting because work by Professor Billy Bryan UC excavated some copper mining sites in Mount Gabriel and also in Ross Island in Killarney, and they were quite early, so that there could have been independent early mining on there. That seems to be the evidence. But again, that's quite early. We're back to the Chalcolithic period, which is the period just before the end of the Neolithic and the start of the Bronze Age, just the first arrival. So there's very early
copper works
or extraction happening at that period. But generally the technologies tend to, like agriculture is thousands of years earlier than we are in the Middle East, and eventually gets to us, that kind of thing, as the populations migrate and so on.
Sure.
And that's the thing about the trying to coordinate, I suppose, the corpus of archaeological knowledge in Europe. Different countries have different periods.
Yes.
So a Bronze Age to us is different to Bronze Age in
Yes.
the Aegean. And so all those have to be borne in mind. So there are efforts to try and kind of harmonise our terminology, particularly in the digital age where we're putting information online and making it accessible and shareable. And I know, I mean, in Ireland, we have the Digital Repositories of Ireland, and TII have a digital heritage collection in that where we post up all our excavation reports and so on, and like that there's a naming convention we use for our period so that digitally we can match up then with data sets from other
Yes.
countries and so on in terms
Yes,
of
yes.
this whole thing about big data, being able to mine data from different countries and gain new meaning from them. You need to kind of harmonise them in some way. So there's a lot
Sure.
of technical efforts going on behind the scenes.
Wow.
But again, the key thing is that each excavation is a primary source of data that gets turned into a technical report, and it's published then to make available. And that becomes part then of this ability to analyse at scale.
Yes.
But I know it's ever evolving.
Sure.
But TII, I have to say, have always been at the forefront, try and push the boundaries out in terms of, and I've always been very supportive in terms of trying to introduce innovation in everything we do. Try and constantly improve standards and innovate. And it's it's a process that just keeps going on. Really.
Sure. I'm just wondering about, let's say Professor Kelly's myth, if you want to put it like that. It's based on, and that gets established in our thinking. Now, you discover something new, it takes a long time for that to feed into the wider picture of where we come from, or whatever detail it is. I'm just trying to see, is there a correlation between, because they say sometimes that for information to change, academia takes the life of a professor. There's an acceptance of it, but the information is way ahead of, rather than academia being ahead of the posse, what comes out of academia is way behind. This is a kind of a theory. And I'm trying to relate that to the way the myth in going further back, historically, the myths that have come down as stories, I don't know where I'm going with this, but it just seems there's a kind of I like the idea of that myth making process being also part of the spread of archaeological knowledge, as in there's a cutting edge, and then there's the rest of the public or academia in general, or historians and all the other geographers and all the other people coming along, integrating this into their, I'm calling it myths, because they change. There's nothing concrete. I mean, there is concrete, but there's nothing concrete as to what it means.
Yeah,
I'm being generalising too
I know.
much.
I
but
understand. I mean, Kelly's work, I wouldn't classify as myth. No, I think it's like there's
no.
experimentally shown that it can work, and I see no reason why it's not true. All the ingredients are there on those site types to say that they were certainly producing hot water. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And like the usual analogy is like it was like a kitchen sink that you'd use for all manner of things, and these sites are probably no different. So I'd say it's rather than a myth, it's very much a theory. But I think I'd be highly surprised if there wasn't truth in it. And I'd say almost certainly that was probably more often than not the reason that these sites were produced or made. But I'd say it probably was that there are other, might be slightly more specialised sites, or forms of these same sites. But I think if you went back to maybe the 80s, any archaeological excavations in the country, by and large, would have been done by universities as part of the university research project and so on. It's only since the 90s, really, when commercial archaeology took off, where development-led archaeology, as they call it, took off. And so the amount of primary excavation work was shifted from being done by universities, which obviously would have been headed by university professors, to commercial archaeologists. So then there's obviously then a small time lag in terms of that information feeding back into academia. But I think these days, in terms of the digital world we live in, these discoveries are becoming known sooner. Generally. Now it can still take a bit of time, maybe for a book to be published or something like that. But even at that, it's still a relatively short window of time. So I think the knowledge feedback going into universities is speeded up, no doubt, because of the technology. And I think the amount of research going on as well equally is speeding up and feeding back out again, because the practitioners on the ground need to know as well, in terms of a research framework, where things are. And if actually that's an interesting point, because there is currently no research framework in Ireland for archaeology in terms of what are the big questions, but at the moment the Discovery Programme are doing just that. They're canvassing across the country to come up with a research framework. So what are the big burning questions? And that now we did have it in the past. We had the Discovery Programme and so on but this is because, I suppose, being updated in light of just the sheer speed of new discovery and just the sheer volume of new discovery. So that then will give an overarching framework, so that when you're doing your day, you get a better sense of where it fits into the overall questioning of where we are.
So I'm just then, where, say, the movement of peoples into the country, the Miletians, the Fomoric, the Tuatha and that account of from that DNA that you were talking about, which kind of ties, from that amount of information, ties the idea of a people actually coming. So we're trying, the myths come down in this mixture of story and unbelievable kind of things, but the science is kind of validating, like that piece in particular, I think, validates the mythical, which passed down from generation to generation. Like, we're here in a place that's in this whole area of where the N22 goes through. You have the languages still there, the connections are just about there, where stuff gets handed down orally as the stories. I just find it really fascinating that science goes off in this very precise direction, and then from the other direction the myth gets validated. It's shrouded a bit, but it can be validated. I just find that really fascinating.
No, it is, and I think I suppose the kind of scientific approach to archaeology is just that. They're trying to be as as truthful as they can in terms of what was found, what can we say about it, and then you can build theories about on top of that. But there's no reason why the two can't merge back together again. The time frame of a myth might get hazy over time, but there's no reason why archaeological evidence for the event in the myth story can't be found or can't be correlated and so on. And I don't see them as being enemies in any sense.
Conflicting.
Necessarily
conflicting.
No, exactly. No, they both aim to record the past, but they just do it by different means. That's all. And they're often recording the same thing, but they might know it yet. You mean that's the beauty of it. But again, it's all back to the jigsaw pieces. Storytelling adds to the jigsaw, map making adds to the jigsaw, mental map making adds to the jigsaw, a sense of place, a sense of a sense of foreboding. You don't go to a certain place. There's that's something you pass on to the child. There's a reason behind that, and it's all connected. It's all a human experience in the day, and it's just recorded and passed on in different ways. And
like the oral recording over generations, like the way I kind of figured out, I can see how this could could be true is because a child hears their parents' myth, call it, right through to today. Whatever set of beliefs you have, you can call it myth.
Yeah.
Like it's how you manage to survive every day.
Yeah.
And a child hears that. That goes right in. What the child hears goes right in. So, in one way, it should be no surprise that a story can come down through many generations within a language or within a culture. It keeps coming down pretty much intact right through to today, and I find that fascinating.
But there's no shortage of examples of that. Like we often get scenarios where I'm thinking of one on I think it's the Archaeological bypass. There was was it Balnacarrig, I think, if memory serves me. But there was a field, and it was called Shanbalia. The field was called. There's no record of a site being there and so on. But but we found a medieval moated site. Late 13th, early 14th century site at that location, and then there was later then a kind of a 17th century farmstead there as well. But that name, and then it was kind of gone. Archaeology, there's nothing else. So that name, the Shanbalia, just
was
survived.
a guide.
It was a guide, but it was laser accuracy. I mean, it was the spot. It was the field.
Sure.
And so much so that we had carried out geophysical survey of it, but the results were, you get a grayscale image from these surveys typically, and you could see some linear features. They kind of looked like typical field boundaries. They didn't jump out, but when the site was actually excavated and you retrospectively looked at geophysics, you could see, actually that was part of this enclosure boundary and so on. And but it was just more the name, the place name, was spot on, and like that.
Yeah.
It depends. Okay, you could argue, does it come from the earlier original moated site, or was it from the 17th century farmstead? But either way, we're talking a few hundred years at least, that the place name stuck. And there was just knowledge that was lost otherwise. The place name drew our attention to it, and that brought our focus to the site, and we did find what was there. So I mean that proves its worth. Just in terms of it deserves the attention it should get. Place name evidence, and we do any archaeological study of any project always has a place name component to it.
Yes.
Because there's very valuable information to be had from that exercise. And we do when archaeologists are typically, in advance of a project, you might walk the fields to see if you can see any sites, and you often talk to landowners, and part of that exercise is to try and see if they have local information, and it frequently points to something that's archaeological, and sometimes even older than that. So it definitely still has currency, in terms of being truthful.
I hear the word in the context of the DNA, which is a whole new field, slightly askew from archaeology, but the idea of disruption of the DNA. Just what do you see in that?
There seems to be two key moments when that happens. One is the interface between the hunter-gatherer societies that we hear, from maybe 8,000 BC, it's about 4,000 BC, and the arrival of farming, the Neolithic peoples coming. The individual that was buried in the passage tomb in County Down, I think it was, her DNA suggested that she was from the Near East, Iraq, Iran. But the two key things about that is that her DNA had very little of the pre-existing hunter-gatherer society DNA, which you might expect if there was kind of an assimilation. So it suggests a kind of a disruptive change happening, whereby the DNA of the previous population does not seem to have made its way down to generations beyond, including ourselves. We have very little DNA in us that comes from the original hunter-gatherer societies that lived on this island, and that disruption seems to have happened then. So whether it was, disease caused by animals coming in that just the previous population had no resistance to, or whether it was conflict, we just don't know. But it just seems from that study that I mentioned, the one by Trinity College Dublin, that that there was a disruption there, that the DNA didn't make way through. The second bit then is we get a change in the early Bronze Age. So Neolithic was a kind of a Stone Age farming period, so they were agriculturalists, but it was still a Stone Age. But when the arrival of metal use came, there was 3 individuals who were dating to the early Bronze Age, so it's kind of the earlier part of that period, and they had DNA quite different to the Neolithic individuals' DNA, and their DNA suggests that they came more from the Pontic Steppes, as I said, kind of Ukraine, Russia. But the thing is that the Irish population generally has a DNA mixture that's very like their Bronze Age DNA mixture. So that suggests that there hasn't been a disruptive genetic disturbance since the Bronze Age.
Then.
So that suggests that genetically there's been continuation by and large from the Bronze Age. It just means that if new people came in, a new DNA mixture came in, we took on their DNA, but we also had our ancestral DNA from the Bronze Age people, but not so from the Neolithic, and not so from the hunter-gatherer DNA, or at least at very, very minimal levels. So we understand it from the paper published. So they're the 2 main disruptions, and the key thing is since the early Bronze Age there seems to be more continuation going on. You can see new DNA coming in, but nothing's kind of replacing the previous. So we haven't had a disruption like that since genetically, and so that's really interesting. And I said that's something that we'd be probably blind to archaeologically, we wouldn't be able to see that, but it's something that's coming through the field of ancient DNA analysis and so on. So it's very exciting stuff, really.
And I suppose it could point to a cultural difference, or it could even suggest genocide, which is included in the Milesian, Tuair de Danann and all of that. That's all in those legends. And the fact that they were able to build large monuments would point to a culture which, because of agriculture, now had the ability to have wealthy people from the product of agriculture meant you had a surplus, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a whole new style of existence once farming came in, rather than being as mobile as you were, following the seasons. In a hunter-gatherer society, you could be more sedentary. You domesticated animals that you kept close to, and you grazed locally. You grew crops locally. You could store foodstuffs, and we do find evidence of that as well. We find maybe more in the Bronze Age, but you get evidence of grain storage pits where they would have stored grain below ground in the over the winter months, and that kept you going through that period. I lost my train of thought there.
But it's just, I suppose,
so they
points to agriculture
exactly.
as being...
So the surplus then meant that it's a form of wealth, the more surplus you had, and that means that you had a stratified society, and that means you were kind of a social elite, and then that social elite with power, control over human resources to be able to build big megalithic tombs for the burying of the dead elite. So it's agriculture that allowed that. It's a different style, it's a different model of economics, a different model of livelihood, and it allowed for that. The hunter-gatherer society may well have continued for another 8,000 years if undisrupted, but because agriculture came in, it just changed the way things happen, and it changed society forevermore, in fact.
And that's a global,
that's
a global phenomenon.
Exactly, yeah. And then when the Bronze Age come in, you have use of metal, and all that did was allow you to do agriculture at scale. You had better implements, better equipment. You could chop down trees more efficiently, clear more land, break up hard soil more efficiently, and so on. And it just meant that things scale up, and then you get population increases as a result. So, one improvement led to another improvement, and
Here we are.
Here we are. Here we are.
Wondering how long we're going to last.
That's it. Yeah.
Just from the point of view of the archaeology on the road project, what really what fascinated you, or what added most to our knowledge?
Yeah, but like the thing with the roads, as I mentioned, you excavate what's on the route, what you find. So that means it could be a small site, a single event site, to a big enclosure and so on. So in terms of the early prehistory, we got quite little, to be honest. In terms of the Mesolithic, we got one site that had a few hollows cut in the ground that gave us a Mesolithic date. Another site, there was a bladelet core. This is where you'd kind of chip off little blades from a piece of flint. They're the only bits of evidence we have of the Mesolithic, so that's the early hunter-gatherer society. When it comes to the Neolithic, the farming community, we can be relatively little. We had a pit in one site in Balmacary that gave us a radiocarbon date from Neolithic. We had another radiocarbon date from Killarclug and Bailake. At the Bailake site, there was a Burnt Mound site, Philocphia site. The earliest phase of it seems to be in late Neolithic. So that's Neolithic evidence, but we've very little else from Neolithic from that period. Now, we had quite a few Bronze Age sites, but they're mostly Philocphia, burnt mounds. But for me personally, what I thought the most fascinating site was a mill site at Killarclug, near the Forish River. It's not far from Carrickfuka Castle. So what drew our attention to the site first was there was, on the Ordnance Survey mapping, there was a farmstead. You could see it in the mapping, early 19th century farmstead. So that drew our attention to it. So we tested we did geophysics first, and then tested the location based on that in effect. So the mapping showed 3 buildings. We found the floor of 2 of them in where they should be, in a kind of, they matched the mapping location. And these are very heavy set stone floors. It's in the floodplain area of the Forish River, so the floor was so heavy to try and keep elevated slightly and keep it dry, we assume. But those floors are built on very gravelly sediment, which wasn't natural subsoil. So the archaeologists who were digging the site, it was TVS Ireland Limited, they continued to dig it down, and extra walls start peering up underneath the gravelly sediment, and it wasn't clear what they were. So they continued digging. Now the thing with excavation is that you dig in the reverse order of time. You dig on the top layers, which is the newest layers, and you dig down until you get the lowest layers. So normally when you describe a site, you describe it on the reverse, on the
yes.
up. You say what was there first, then what happened. But just in terms of giving you a sense of the excitement of archaeology, I'll stick with the order which it was dug, because it kind of it shares a bit in terms of us not quite knowing what we have and how it reveals itself. So they started showing up some walls underneath the gravel, and when they cleared it all back, they got the remains of buildings. It was clear, but it was clear that they weren't kind of houses, that they had certain configuration, and it turns out that they were 2 stone mill buildings. So they had each had a wheel pit. So you had the walls would be dug, constructed to form a pit where the mill wheel would be housed, and they'd have next to it a gear pit, and that's where all your gear apparatus would be, where the water would power the mill. So these are water powered mills. It would turn the mill, and that will operate all the mill machinery. So it was clear they were mills. So the next thing was to figure out what they were. Now it appears that first of all, that the wheel pits, the height of them relative to, I should say that they found a what they call a contourlete. This was separate to the site, or part of the site. There was the archaeologists identified a kind of a long linear cut that just seemed to just kind of snake its way off into the distance. And then on another site, not too far away, well, a good 300 meters away, they found a similar cut meandering its way past there as well. And when they did the levels on it, they realised that there was, we're only talking centimetres of a difference of fall in the levels. And that was a telltale sign that this was a mill race to bring water from the Forish River to the mill sites. and they follow that's why they call it contour, because it follows the contour of the land to keep it steady. If it's too much of a flow, you'll break the mill apparatus. If it's too slow, it might backwash out, and that's not what you want. So it was like the engineering had to be precise. So they snaked around the landscape, and they brought water to the mill sites, and given at the height of the leat, it suggests that the mill wheels were what they call breast shots, so it came in midway through the mill rather than an overshot at the top of the mill.
Yes.
So anyway, the specialist, Dr. Colin, who looked at this, he felt that I should say that they also associated with one of the mills was a mill house building. It had very large flagstone floor. It was a walled-in building. And he feels that was, and also had a flue and a fireplace, and he felt that the whole thing was for textiles, that it was a fulling mill, and that the flue and the chimney was for part of the dyeing process and so on, to dye the textiles.
So what era?
Yeah, so that first one, the farmstead, as I said, that would have been above it. It was about early 19th century. The dating evidence from these two mills suggests it was mid 17th century. So they would have continued in use until they eventually went out of use. It was covered over by sediment, and then the farmstead came in afterwards. But as they dug down and they excavated these two mill buildings, under one of them they discovered a new alignment of walls, slightly different to the one above, and it was clear that they were talking about another stone mill building, water powered mill underneath that had been kind of replaced by added to by the later mill. They changed the alignment of the wheel pit and the gear pit and so on, and that lower mill building that dated to the 16th century. So you now had a 16th century original water powered mill, stone built, that was replaced by a building directly on top of it, and a second one. So they obviously the milling operation expanded in the 17th century. It was there in the 16th century, but the mill house associated with that lower mill had been modified in the later phase. But what was interesting is the mill house that was connected to the 16th century mill, the floor of that mill house had broken millstones, and that suggests that there must have been an earlier
corn mill.
Well, a corn mill, but an earlier mill as well, because there were broken flagstones in the mill house of that building. So when they dug below that stone building, they got the remnants of a timber mill below that again, and that was dated to the mid to late 15th century. So we're talking mid to late 1400s. So
as a kind of an architectural encapsulation of a site going down and finding new. There's something else. There's something else. There's something else.
That's the excitement about it. That it was literally that they as they dug through, they just got more and more evidence of a new mill below. Now we're lucky in that site. There is a good mapping evidence. There is the Down Survey of Ireland does show a mill at that very approximate location. Now the scale of that mapping is very inaccurate, but so there is that, and there's also some historical records as well. But the Dr. Colin, who studied the mill, he said it was the most important mill to have been excavated in Ireland in recent years. It was the earliest example of a fulling mill in Ireland, the 16th century, the 17th century fulling mill. And with the mill buildings, they found all these bearing stones and pivot stones. Now these are stones that the metal parts of the wheel would sit on, and obviously be scoured out over time and eventually break, and they just replace the stone. So there was 25 roughly of those stones from the site, and he says it's the largest number of those ever excavated in Europe. That they tend not to be found. So academically that's a big discovery. And he said what's remarkable is that the degree of continuity from a medieval mill to the post-medieval mill has not been demonstrated archaeologically in Ireland before. Mills of different dates have been excavated, but it's the first time that we've excavated a sequence from the mid 15th century up to, when it went out of abandoned probably in the late 17th, in the 18th century. The other thing is that the millstones, these were conglomerate stones. Dr. Richard Duinnín of UCC, a geologist, he studied those, and he feels that they were quarried in Harrylock in the Hook Peninsula in County Waterford. Wexford, sorry. That's approximately 180 kilometres away, and it's the longest recorded distance travelled by a millstone from an Irish quarry up to the modern period. In terms of demonstrating that they travelled that far. So an absolutely fascinating site. Like it was more like an urban excavation than a rural excavation, because rural sites tend to be very shallow, whereas this went on meters in depth. It was a fascinating site.
So how can people see? Is it possible for people? Have you made any reconstruction visuals of this? Just for people to see.
Yeah, no, like obviously with the excavation, the sites then there's a full report on the excavations, and that would include all the specialist contributions and so on. And in that there are reconstruction drawings of how the mill would have operated, the mills, I should say, over time. And obviously we're in the process of producing a book on the archaeology from the scheme as a whole. And that site will feature prominently in it, and the reconstruction drawings will be available for the public to see. But fascinating site.
Absolutely.
And it's not too far from Castelfouca Castle, so it seems likely that the owners, as part of the estate.
Yes.
And it's probably that there was when the estate was bought over, that the new people who bought it, this is part of the new enterprise. Kind of part of the industrialization of the rural kind of landscape and so on. But an amazing site.
Fantastic. Yeah. It's just it brings me back to something I jokingly said before we met at all, was, if you have an interesting archaeological site that it exists, the best thing is if you could steer a road to go over it. It'll get excavated.
Well, I mean, it's.
I'm only joking.
Yeah, no, there's a kind of I don't know what the word is, a contradiction of sorts, in that if a site is completely avoided, it's protected insofar as it's protected at this moment in time. Who knows what natural processes will do to it over the centuries? But the opportunity to excavate is an opportunity, and that's often forgotten. It's not all about archaeology being a risk. Each road project, each greenway project, each Lewis project is a fantastic opportunity to gain new insights into all manner of archaeological discovery, and it all adds to the pot. It adds to the jigsaw pieces. It adds to the discourse and the academic debate and research and so on. And it's an amazing opportunity, and we've been riding that wave of opportunity now for the last few decades, and it's bearing fruit. There's, as I said, we must be approaching 40 books at this stage, and I think there's about it's well over 150 academic papers and articles and stuff published, all relating to archaeological works coming from these projects, and it's remarkable.
Yeah, it's been a fantastic trip. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Compacted into a chat.
No, thanks very much for the invite. It's great to have a chance to just have a chat and talk about these discoveries.